Awesome.
All right, perfect. All right, guys, welcome to VR Book Club. And we are going to be discussing today the full book of Build a Vampire by Rick Gualtieri, who is standing right there. So let's get some emojis for
Hey, guys.
Rick for coming out today. I am so excited. I know there's a lot of you guys out there that are really excited too, and we're looking forward to it. So we'll go ahead and jump in with some questions for Rick. And then what we'll do after that is I'll give you guys a chance to ask some of your own questions, comment on the book. I know Matt's going to have a lot because I think he's on book 5 already.
Yeah, I try not to ruin it, though. You know?
Yeah, don't give any spoilers.
So I'll try not to ruin it.
That's why I've held back and haven't read beyond the first one yet.
I couldn't help myself.
Let me go ahead and we'll start with some questions just for you instead of the book. We'll get to the book second. So I know when I asked you to come, you mentioned that you had already kind of been experimenting a little bit with virtual reality, right?
To a small degree. I have a Sony PlayStation VR. I also have, I got Jedi challenges for Christmas, so that's more augmented reality, but still wearing something on my head. So.
Cool. So what do you think of using virtual reality as a different medium for authors?
Well, this is a first for me, and I've told some other authors I'm friends with, and they're like interested. They're like, I know they were telling me like, you know, you got to tell us how it goes, dude. So I mean, something I'd say it's new. It's kind of untested in this medium, but I think it's kind of cool because I was telling you earlier that like I'm trying to up my con schedule this year, like in person. And one of the things, if you guys have done conventions, is there's usually panels, you know, whether it's like, you know, authors, artists, whoever. And this strikes me as a cool way to like, you know, to get on, do a panel virtually without actually having to leave in the home, which opens up the opportunity to possibly doing more over the year. You know, as opposed to like, you know, looking at my budget and going, okay, you know, I got to travel here. That's going to cost $1,000 or so.
So, of course, Rick writes the Build a Vampire Toma Bill series. He also wrote Bigfoot Hunters, and he's a member of a Pathfinder group called Authors and Dragons, who also writes additional things. And I have read The Ghost of Hooker Alley, and I've also read Brandon Thighmaster. Which I was dying. So why don't you tell us a little bit first about Shingles?
Okay. Well, Shingles was an idea we had. We've been like the group has been looking to like, you know, most of us are comedy fantasy horror writers. Oh, and let me back up for a second. Let me just say, I have this nasty habit of talking faster when I get excited, and I'm super excited now. So. If I start going too fast, just tell me to slow down. But Shingles came about as just an idea that we had. You know, a lot of us were fans of, you know, won't say the name of it because of like, you know, we've been trying to play it coy, but another series based off of a skin condition aimed at children. And we were like, you know something, we all read this stuff as kids and now we're adults and now we like, you know, now we like more visceral humor. So the idea was, well, what if we like kind of did an homage / mockery of that, where we're essentially writing short stories in a very humorous but like horrifically adult fashion, you know. So the first book was by Robert Bevan. It's called The Ghost of Hooker Alley. That came out last month. The second book actually comes out on Friday, and that's by me. It's called Gary's Children, and I'll just say it's about a guy who. He buys a cursed sex toy and winds up getting haunted by the ghosts of all the children he's flushed away.
Oh my goodness.
What?
We'll be reading that.
And the plan there is we're going to come out with a new book like they're short books. They're about maybe 100 pages long. So we're looking to like release one a month. just to grow the library quickly. And they're a lot of fun to write because we're not putting any limits on ourselves. So any sick thing that comes to mind that we can attach a story to it, we're like, well, yeah, let's run with that.
If you guys haven't heard of it, Authors and Dragons, they're on YouTube. They have, I don't know, 160 episodes?
60.
Videos? Okay. Yes. I've listened to a couple of them. And even if you're not like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, if you don't even know how to play, they're really funny to listen to because they role play very well and they make their characters do the most random things ever, like go into wells for no reason. Which was one of your very first ones, I think, might have been the first one. So you guys should definitely check that out. Now, on Bill the Vampire, what made you decide to write an anti-vampire vampire book?
Well, I mean, somebody was mentioning earlier, like, a lot of people who play D&D, they wind up writing, like, stories about their D&D characters. Well, Bill started off as just kind of a thought experiment of, well, what if my D&D group was actually kind of in the game? And eventually I was like, no, instead of being in the game, what if like the monsters were real and like, and we had to deal with them or so. And my D&D group, they're awesome guys. We're a bunch of assholes. So, and I mean, it just kind of started off in there, and eventually I just kind of like, condensed it down. I was like, well, what if I made this about like one character in particular? And it was kind of like an anti-Twilight story, and it just kind of came together from there. It was really just kind of like, started from like, kind of like, okay, these guys are fun to game with. What if I actually had to like, kill monsters with them in real life?
So does that mean that your group is actually like in the book, like who's Ed and who's Tom, who's Bill?
Not really. Like, when I eventually, Tom, Ed, and Bill, they're kind of like all amalgamations of various people. I can't really point to anyone and say like, well, Ed is like, this guy Tony or so. He's not. Like they're all, each of them kind of encompass like, various features of like, the gaming group. A few of them encompass features of myself. So like none of them is really based on a real person, as opposed to they're based on parts of real people.
Okay, so then on a scale of 1 to nerd, where do you fall?
Oh, geez. I don't know. I like geeky things. I mean, there's certain things that Bill does that I would want to punch him out for. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm sitting in my home office right now. I'm surrounded by like, literally like, dozens of like, vintage Transformers and like Godzilla figures and other stuff. So, that should say it all.
All right, very cool, very cool. I do not have any Transformers, but I have dragons everywhere. That's my thing. My living room's dragons, and my office is dragons. I have dragons everywhere. So when we last left off, guys, on Bill the Vampire, it was right after the scene where Bill basically got his ass kicked in the alley and James came to rescue him. So since then, we finished the rest of the book. We saw what happened to Night Razor, and how Sally did a very good job of kind of working behind the scenes to change Bill's image. So I'm going to ask you guys now to go ahead and give me the rest of your thoughts on the remaining portions of the book. We can start with either John, Matt, or Mike. Whichever one of you wants to go first.
You guys can go first. I got a question on deck. Or not really even a question.
I got nothing right now.
I got more of a comment. Like there's certain things about this series that I've never found in any other type of series. Like not just the jokes, but the way you present them. Like the scene when he says, I opened the door to my apartment and it was an absolute bloodbath. My friends were slaughtered like cattle, and I was like, holy crap! I love those guys. This is horror. Oh, he was just kidding, and I was like, oh my god! I like started cracking up. I woke my wife up.
First-person narrative is the unreliable narrator.
Oh yeah, I was like, oh man, it's horrible. I love those two guys. They was like, oh, totally got me. Loved it.
Yeah, little in jokes where he constantly comments that, well, this would have happened, but I was too slow. So finally got out the first 2 words and got knocked out.
Well, a lot of that came about just for the sake of me being a dumbass and not knowing what I was doing as a writer. So like, like this is before like, getting heavy into the author community and stuff, where I was learning where it's like, oh, you actually really shouldn't do that stuff. And I was like, but I kind of did, and it kind of worked.
Hey, well, Ferris Bueller was the first actor to, like talk into the camera. So, and that's, so whatever, you got to play
Well, as long
around.
as that kind of stuff isn't overdone, I don't see a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it was overdone. I feel like you took like the most cliche and the most like odds are this is what would really happen, and then you kind of found a funny thing niche in between. And I really like that. I thought that was a really nice for the for the reader. I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like the first person narration because I like Bill's thoughts because they're probably the same things that I would probably think but would never say out loud. Although I think Bill would say more out loud than I ever would. But it's nice to kind of be like, yeah, I'd probably think the same thing about this guy being, a jerk, whatever he is. But Bill, I think's a little bit. Bill always just seems to get himself in trouble.
Well, and writing it that way also. Writing it that way kind of gets me in trouble too, because like, I mean, a lot of people take offense at the series because, you're in, like, the thing is, you're in Bill's mind and you're seeing all of his unsavory thoughts, and he has a lot. I mean, and that's just because I think it's kind of human. I mean, in our minds, we're kind of free. So, we might be sitting in church and and being quiet. And in the meantime, in our heads, we might be looking at being like, that person across from me, they kind of suck, And the thing is, you're kind of uncensored in Bill's mind, so you're seeing kind of all those unsavory thoughts, and a lot of people really don't like that because they're like, well, a real hero wouldn't have those thoughts, and I'm like, well, if you were really in that hero's brain, he actually might.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think was really cool.
But not only that, I felt like, despite the fact that these are very unsavory kind of personality traits that a lot of people complain about, as someone who's been part of these geek communities for most of my life, I can tell you flat out, it is incredibly accurate. And how these people think. There is definitely a lot of kind of and it's been an issue for the last few years, something that's been brought up a whole lot, so it's pretty relevant. But there is a lot of misogyny in the geek culture currently, so.
I mean, one thing there is like, like, and you see this in a lot of books where like, somebody comes in and like, I don't know, some dorky, like, he joins a game or he does something and he gets all the women and stuff. And I didn't want that. I was like, something in real life that doesn't work that way. So my whole thing with Bill is like, yeah, he's like that in his head, but it never really kind of works for him. It just winds up getting him like in more trouble.
Yep.
Now, I know you mentioned that one of your favorite characters that you wrote was Sally. And there's another one, but we haven't met her yet, so I won't mention her yet. But Sally, and I love Sally because she really is a bitch. But Bill makes sure that she knows that multiple times. But I think she's awesome. But is there a character that you wrote that you were like, oh, I have to write about this guy again, or one that you were just like, I don't like this character, but he's really important to the story, so I have to get him in here?
Not really. I mean, if I didn't like a character, like, chances are he died pretty quickly. I mean, Night Razor is supposed to be kind of like, kind of a jock. He's basically the jock in Revenge of the Nerds who you like, who's just like, just a total ass. I mean, but at the same time, he's kind of a charismatic ass, I guess. I mean, yeah, I mean, even characters that like, other people hate, like Colin, for example, I still kind of have fun writing them because, I don't know, I try to have fun with all the characters. And I mean, in later books, there's some really reprehensible, like, characters, and there's some ridiculous characters as well. And I mean, my whole thing is I have a lot of fun writing the books, and I'm a big fan. I'm a big believer that, like, for example, when you watch a movie, I think you can kind of tell when an actor is like, really enjoying a role versus like, just phoning it in. And like, so as a result, I kind of try not to write too many characters I don't like, simply because I think that would kind of come across as like, okay, obviously I hate this person. You're going to hate this person too. Let's get rid of them. They should not be on scene or on camera.
Right. Cool. Yeah, guys, wait till you meet Turd.
I should send Shannon a message as soon as I read that part. I was like, oh my god, I just read this part about Turd. I had to stop reading immediately and send her a message.
Yes, wait till you meet Turd. John, did you have a question?
Yes, I do have one question for Rick, and that is, how in this world does James know about Darkwing Duck? Stuck with me the whole book. Stuck with me the whole book. How does he know Darkwing Duck?
You know, because James is a worldly guy, like it's probably not. I'm trying to remember if they call him that in book 1 or if you don't hear that in book 2, but not really much of a spoiler. But his nickname is the Wanderer, and he's one of those. He's one of those like if you ever saw or read Interview with the Vampire, you have a lot of those vampires who kind of they're several hundred years old, but they never go out and do anything. They live in their own little insular world. And James, I wanted to write as somebody who's like, hey, I'm immortal. I have this long life. I have all these powers. I want to get out there and do stuff. So he's not only out there, learning about other cultures, adventuring, but I envisioned him as somebody who would actually be up on pop culture, just so he doesn't come across as somebody who's 600 years old at any given time.
So he's on a 20-hour airplane flight and he just sits there and watches kids' cartoons. Got it.
or flipping channels and catches his eye. He strikes me as of all the vampires in the book, he strikes me as the guy with the most open mind, who would look in where everybody else would say this is ridiculous, and he'd be like, well, let me give it a try,
He's easily one of my favorite characters in the book. Yeah, especially being in book 5, he's still definitely one of my favorites. He's so level-headed. And I love how everyone keeps trying to kiss his ass, and he's like, no, I'm used to him. I'm used to him.
He tolerates Bill and Sally's banter very well, whereas a lot of the other vampires are just like, can you stop? And James tolerates it fairly well, because as you guys can imagine, the banter between Sally and Bill continues through later books, which is some of my favorite parts of all of the books is the banter between the two of them.
One of these days I would, and I kind of dread doing it because I know it would involve a ton of research, but I actually would not mind writing a James origin story, just kind of something that kind of chronicles his first 500 years or so.
Oh yeah, I'd read that.
That'd be interesting.
It would be more of an adventure than a comedy because he has an open mind and stuff, but I mean he's not a doofus like Bill. But I wrote a short story on my blog that was kind of the days before he turned into a vampire. It's maybe 1,000 words or so, but I kind of wrote that almost kind of as an incentive to myself to eventually say okay, get your ass back to this and actually fill it out.
Well, I will say, and even in the first book, pretty much his first appearance, you did make it pretty obvious that he was a curious type with how he treated Bill, was observing the situation, but stepped in when he needed to because it struck me as he wanted to see where things would go. So kind of that bored, curious type.
Yeah, I picture him looking at his nails, buffing them on his shirt, just kind of watching the whole thing, something's going to happen.
Something interesting happens.
Oh, yeah. Well, he's a guy who's been there, done that. I mean, he's been around for a while. So, he's bored, but then something kind of new happens, and suddenly he's interested again.
Red, you had a question?
Oh, she's muted.
She's like, crap, my mute button. It's behind me somewhere.
Yeah, I saw that. Thanks, Lauren. So actually, it's funny that you mentioned turning your D&D characters into a story because I'm actually going to be doing that soon. And I was just wondering if you had any suggestions when it comes to that, should I leave certain parts out about the actual sessions or go all in? I'm new to it. I haven't written a book in a long time.
Here's the thing. You always have to take into account the legal concept of it. And and if you're gonna do it kind of a word for word adventure, you kind of probably need to get your other party members to sign off on it. Whereas if you're paraphrasing it and kind of giving the characters new names, new professions, changing up the anecdotes, that's a little different. You have a better shot of of that. So I would say protect yourself legally. But I mean, as far as the rest of it goes, I would say be realistic. Like one thing I see in a lot of author forums is everybody's always worried, oh, I don't want to do this because it's going to offend somebody. I don't want to do that. You know, if you worry about offending somebody, there's no way to write something that won't offend somebody. So keep that spirit of whatever you find to be entertaining in the writing. You know, don't water it down. Don't worry what people aren't gonna think of it. Here's the thing: if somebody's offended by it, they're not your audience, so don't worry about it. You know, instead focus on the people who are your audience. So I mean that's probably my two big things. Yeah, like one, CYA, cover your ass, and two, make it so that you're actually being true to the stuff you're writing about.
Very
All
good
right, thank
advice,
you.
and I agree. I know that I'm a writer, and there's several writers that are in our audience. Can you, without giving away any of your trade secrets, explain a little bit of your writing process, how you start? Just because as a writer, I'm always looking to try new ways to motivate myself to finish this novel that's 67,000 words and hasn't been edited yet. And so anything that you can share with any any authors or writers to help them.
All right. Well,
and I know
first,
you do some YouTube videos on that too.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, toss out the idea of trade secrets. I mean, here's the thing: anybody who tells you that they have a secret, chances are either they're BSing you or they're trying to sell you a course. I'm an open book. I'm more than happy to talk about how I do things, and it really just comes down to it really just comes down to how badly do you want it. And I mean, this is kind of like a dream come true for me. I mean, looking at the number of books I've I've sold, looking at the number of people I've talked to, this comes down to dream job. When I when I was a kid, growing up, it was kind of like, okay, I could, if you asked me what my dream jobs were, it would have been paleontologist, actor, or writer. And I don't have acting chops, and I really don't like the desert. So turns out the writer thing is really awesome. But I mean, I would also say, a lot of people will say, well, I have a full-time job, I have kids, I have a family or so, I don't have time. And to that I would say BS. That's bullshit. And sorry for the language. Here's the thing. We all can find a little bit of downtime in our lives, whether it's whether you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to watch an hour less TV today, or I'm going to sit down and just write for 10 minutes. Anything you do is forward motion. Even if you say, well, I only have time to write 100 words today. Well, something, that's 100 words more than you had yesterday. And if you add that over a year, you have a novel.
See, I wrote all of my novels during National Novel Writing Month. So I know novels. So if anything's a motivator, it's you have 30 days to write 50,000 words. Problem is that when you spend 30 days and you write 50,000 words, then you have to go back and say, okay, I have to fix this because I just did 2,000 words a day, every day, at midnight, and I don't even know what I wrote. So what would you suggest for, after you have that first draft, how do you make yourself go back and say, okay, how do I fix this? Or, I mean, obviously that's a very frustrating time too, as editing is extremely frustrating. So what advice do you have on that?
It's frustrating and it is boring as hell.
It is.
Well, I mean, I guess it all depends. It all comes down to
someone.
Well, here's the thing. Yes, you do want to hire somebody, but I personally prefer. I don't want to hand off a first draft to an editor because my first drafts are crap. I would say, first of all, it depends what you want to do with the book. If you wrote it during NaNoWriMo for yourself, well, then you don't really have to do anything. If you wrote it for a blog, it only needs a little bit of polishing. If you wrote it to sell it, well, you have to put on your business hat, let it sit for a little bit. Hey, get your motivation back, and something, open it up, and the first thing you want to do is just read through it without editing it, just to make sure it's coherent. That's the first thing I do. My first editing pass is just opening it up. All right, let me take a day or two, read through this, and see if it's incoherent crap or not. If it's incoherent crap, it goes right back to the drawing board, in which case, major rewrites. If it's coherent, then I start polishing it. And typically what I'll do is I'll go through it 3 or 4 times. The third draft goes out to beta readers, which are really just like, I send it out just to get like opinions on the story. And the fourth draft goes out to Megan, my editor. And at that point, the story is set in stone, and that's where we're polishing it for typos and stuff. Like I don't worry about typos early on, misspelled words. It's near the end there where I try to kill that stuff and put that final sheen on the book.
Yeah, the red squigglies, they drive my OCD up the wall. I'm like, oh, there's a red squiggly. Oh no, another red squiggly. So I have to that's actually one of my first things is I go through and correct those, just because if I'm reading it and I skip over it, I can't make myself skip the red squigglies.
Well, rather than go through it, just hit spell check.
Yeah. Now, oh, excuse me. We're at the halfway mark. So what I'm going to do is on the book itself, I'm going to open up all questions for everyone. If you want to ask something related to VR or writing or the book or whatever you guys want to discuss with Rick regarding the book, I'll open that up to you guys. So just use an emoji, preferably this one, so I can call you out, and then we'll just kind of do a Q&A. So you guys can ask whatever you want. Oddity, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little about this right before the event, with how you're kind of like the guinea pig for the VR and these kind of events. What would be your first impressions? Like, what do you see the potential for this?
Well, I mean, I think it would be a little cooler if I do if I do finally upgrade my PC and get a full VR system. That said, I think it's kind of cool. I mean, here's the thing. The cool part about doing this versus just just I don't know, just in a chat room is that you can hear the inflection in people's voices, which is awesome. I can see you guys moving around. I can see the emojis and stuff, which just adds a lot of personality to it. But at the same time, I'm sitting here in my house, nice and comfortable. So I would say, outside of conflicting schedules, I really couldn't think of any reason to not do something like this again, because it's pretty cool.
Yeah, being on the other end of this, I've seen so many events and stuff where it literally connects, you and authors and stuff, and it's just it bridges a certain gap that can't be really reached in general otherwise.
Yeah, I would say meeting somebody in person at a con is is definitely the pinnacle. But I mean, if this is striking me as kind of the next best thing, if you will.
Yeah, no, I
someone doesn't
absolutely
live near
totally
enough
agree.
to large cities for the good cons.
Yeah, I don't either.
Thank you.
Lynn, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I've asked this of other authors before, but I'm curious what your take on this is. Why do you think we're so obsessed and in love with the lure of vampires? And why do you think that that's a genre that we keep picking up books and watching movies? What is it about vampires that we love so much?
Well, I think one of the cool things about vampires is they're so versatile. They can be so many things to so many people. I mean, growing up, I used to watch the Hammer films with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and it was all about Dracula being the monster, and I thought that was awesome. But then it was but then we moved into the phase of Buffy and stuff, and and also once again Anne Rice, and vampires were the brooding heroes, or and such. And I mean, and in some cases otherwise they can be superheroes. I mean, you essentially have these characters who are human to the nth degree, but there's something but they're not human at the same time. So they can be the ultimate love interest, the ultimate hero, the ultimate bad guy. They can really be almost anything you think about. And there's very few monsters that that you can put in that thing. I mean, there's werewolves and stuff, but I mean, with the romantic interest, you can only go so far with them before you get weird.
Yeah, that's true.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah. And mummy erotica, hopefully that's not a thing.
Now that you've said it, it's now a thing online somewhere.
It's going to be
one to write the first book.
Awesome.
I think I was on to something.
John.
All right, being the nerd I am, I gotta ask: was there any point of Build a Vampire where you took a little bit of inspiration from any of the White Wolf properties, like Vampire the Masquerade and the like?
Honestly, not really. I like I back years ago they had like a short-lived series on Fox that was like Vampire the Masquerade, and I watched that a couple times. I didn't really.
Embraced, actually.
Yeah,
I remember it. I was
yeah. I didn't
My tracking's
like,
broke.
Yeah, I got to be honest, I didn't like it. I got invited to LARP a few times, like with Vampire the Masquerade, and honestly, I just never got around to it. So I'm only like vaguely familiar with it, so I really didn't take anything from that. That said, I mean, like I said, growing up on the Hammer films, watching like movies like Fright Night, Lost Boys, Buffy, reading like Stephen King novels, I did kind of a a salad bar approach to my vampires, and kind of like was like I like that aspect of their powers. I don't like that aspect of their powers. Kind of built my own from scratch.
The main reason I asked is just because of the modern setting plus vampires. So I just felt like I had to clarify that little tidbit. And like what you just said, the salad bar approach, Vampire the Masquerade does pull a lot of that. They pull in a lot from different vampires mythoses between the different clans. So that would be why there might be some similarities.
Yeah, and I know last time when we met to discuss the first half, we had a discussion on what vampire cliches were there and which ones were actually kind of flipped around and like weren't part of it. And we actually really agreed on, I really liked the fact that, you don't become a vampire and then all of a sudden you're like super sexy. Because that made the vampire more like humanized a little bit. Also, one thing that Rick does too is your zombies work in an office. And don't necessarily chase you around wanting to eat your brains, which I thought was cool too when they go to go find James and all the zombies are like behind their desks.
Aren't all desk monkeys zombies in their own way?
It was kind of satirical, yeah.
Yeah, there was definitely that concept, because I mean, starting off, I was working in like cubes and stuff when I was first like writing this, and I was like, what are we like, at a desk job but cubicle veal, and like what would be more perfect than like than just having the mindless zombies just doing paperwork.
Yeah, I thought that was great. Matt, you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering like how the books kind of like seem to, there's like the individual book story, and then there's like the whole series slung story. And I haven't finished. I'm still in book 5, but like, did you have an idea for like an outline for the whole series when you started writing, or did you just kind of go book to book to book, and then when it was done, it was done?
When I started Build a Vampire, I wasn't sure if it was going to be standalone or if it was going to be a series. So what I purposely did was I left hooks for myself in there, kind of like little Easter eggs that I could pick up later. But when I wrote the first book, I kind of didn't know where it was going. It wasn't until book 2 that I started to get the idea for like where the full series was going. And by book 3, pretty much like where I was going was kind of solidified.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Now, do you have any plans on, I know that, book 8, it's kind of done, but do you have any plans on any additional spin-offs with any other characters? I know you did like a shorter one with Sally from Sally's point of view, but do you have any more that you might be working on that are in relation to Tomabel?
Oh yeah, I mean, later in the year, I plan. Here's the thing. I put a lot of work into that world. I had a lot of fun with it, and I like after book 8, I just didn't want to abandon it, and also those characters as well. So I will say that I can't start it yet until I do something else, but I do have a spin-off, like with it takes place in that world, but it's like not, but it's with a new character. But later this year, I am starting a sequel series.
That's exciting.
And
you'll be done with book 8 by then, Matt.
Yeah, well, yeah, hopefully I'm done in the next like week or two.
Very
so
cool.
I won't spoil anything there, but yeah, like it definitely takes place like years down the line after book 8.
Very cool. Oddity, you have a question.
Yeah, this is a little off, I supposedly off topic, but considering vampires and such, but is there any other fantasy genre that you kind of wanted to tackle and include in
That's a great question.
what you were, like, your style and what you wanted to kind of write?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm actually a multi-genre author. I mean, Bill the Vampire is kind of urban fantasy / horror comedy. Bigfoot Hunters, that's a straight horror novel. I love monster thrillers, so that was a lot of fun to write. I have a couple more risque books under a pen name, which were fun to write. I have one out there that's actually close to, I won't say it's a YA book, but it's probably like a young adult book called Midnight's Daughter. So in some ways I'm kind of bouncing around a bit, but so I'm trying to kind of figure out brand identity. So people because one of the problems I've had with Bigfoot Hunters is I think probably the worst reviews I get from that is people who say, I picked it up, it wasn't funny. It's not meant to be funny. So I'm trying to work on brand identity. So so that I'm getting a little bit better at that. But I mean, as far as different genres, I mean, when I have an idea, I kind of go with it. I don't just say, well, hey, that's a sci-fi story, and I'm an urban fantasy writer. I can't write that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very cool.
problem.
Lynn.
Yeah, I was just curious if you've ever thought about moving your stories into another medium, like television or film.
Good question.
Well, okay, well,
Because it sounds, this one, and I
Netflix,
have to
right?
apologize, I haven't written it yet, read it.
I am moving into another medium in a couple of weeks. I have actually the Bill the Vampire, the comic book, issue 1, almost ready to go.
Oh.
So that's more of a visual medium. I mean, as far as the rest goes, I've talked to a few places for for TV or film, but I've talked to like 3 places, and the deals have never been right. So, well, okay, I won't say the deals haven't been right. The people I've talked to at the end, I looked at the contracts and I was like, I don't think I want to sign this. So I am all for it. It's just it just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, well, kudos to you for staying true to your stories and not
Well,
selling
it's
out
staying
just
true.
for
It's staying
TV
true to the
outlets.
story. But I'll say this for any writers in the audience: when somebody approaches you for movie option rights, stop and actually write. Stop. Don't just sign it. Get a lawyer and actually look at that, because the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of people in there. They're gonna try to just get all of your rights and leave you with nothing. So it's not only being true to your story; it's also making sure that legally you're not getting shafted.
Very good advice. Matt, I think you had another question.
Yeah, I was like, building on hers, like, yeah, don't let what happened to like Dresden Files happen to your books, because I was quite disappointed at the end.
Yes, I was also disappointed
you
in
know,
the 7 episodes.
I'm gonna just say, I didn't hate that. I didn't hate the series, and a lot of people hate me for saying this, but I liked what the series did with Bob better than what he did in the books with Bob.
I definitely agree with you,
I
but,
don't
like,
know if
but
I
they
agree
changed-
with that.
Well, they changed so much though. There was and it seemed like there was so many things that there was like fundamental things that they changed. But anyway, my question was, are there any other like urban fantasies? Like, what would you say is your favorite? Versus like Iron Druid or Dresden or some of the others. What's your favorite urban fantasy?
I love Dresden Files. I will say there a couple of the latter books I wasn't too fond of.
Like when he
It'll-
died.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I did not like Ghost Story.
Yeah, me neither.
It was a little.
Wasn't
bit
my
of a-
favorite.
yeah, it wasn't my favorite either.
Yeah.
But book 12
Yeah.
was so good. The changes. Oh.
Changes was good, and you know something? I didn't like Ghost Story. I didn't like Cold Days or so. But Skin Game I thought was really good.
Hmm.
It was. The ending was so good.
Yeah. And of course now we haven't had a book for like 2 years now or something.
Yeah, well, he wrote that.
I
he wrote
know.
that other book, and then we haven't seen anything for years.
If
I mean,
he's
other
got a
stuff-
timer, I think on his website that says there's like 30,000 days until it's just, because everyone keeps asking him, when's book 16 coming? And he's just got this like 30,000 day timer that doesn't actually time down.
Yeah,
Um,
Sanderson's got a thing on his website that says, "I'll finish this book before that one guy finishes that one book." And he's like,
Oh, jeez.
Every time someone asks, it just adds to the timer.
Oh yeah, well that's probably what happened to Rothfuss then, right?
it was really funny because, and I've told this story before, I hadn't heard of Build a Vampire, and you know how when you're browsing the internet and then you go on Facebook and then you see the ads, but they're totally tailored to whatever you were looking for on Google Chrome. And I was doing that and Build a Vampire popped up. And I was like, I like vampire stories. So I clicked on it, and then it said if you like, Jim Butcher and Kevin Hearn. And I was like, I'm going to read it because those are actually two of my favorite authors. And then I read all 8 books in a week because I'm crazy.
I actually hate doing that because it strikes me as the tackiest thing in the world to ever say, if you like reading so-and-so. But the problem is it's one of those marketing tactics that works. So it's kind of one of those, like, you do it and you feel dirty. But if you don't do it, you kind of, deal with the consequences of nobody reading your shit.
Well, I'm kind of
But it did. I think it did. It worked for me because I was like, I've got to read this now.
I would have found the Iron Druid Chronicles if I didn't read Dresden Files. If you like Dresden Files, you'll like Iron Druid, and I love that series. Yeah. And I never heard of your series until Shannon told me we were reading book club, and I'm loving it just as much as I like Dresden Files and all that. So I'm really
appreciate that.
I wish I had seen it earlier, and I probably would have read them years ago.
Well, if you like Dresden,
sorry.
I was going to say, if you like Dresden, there's another series out there by James Hunter called Yancey Lazarus. And it's kind of like a grittier version of Dresden. I think he has like 4 or 5 books out, but I'm greatly enjoying that. I really like his attention to detail.
Well, awesome. I'll look into it.
Very cool. Very cool. Mike, you've been quiet. This is unacceptable.
He jumped.
What the hell, Mike?
Yeah, Mike. Come on, Mike.
What'd you
I know
think,
you read
Mike?
it. What'd you think?
Oh, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But have you ever wondered why vampires can't go out in the sunlight, but they can have lights within the home and that doesn't hurt them? You ever wondered that, or do you just kind of just say, "Well, I'm just gonna go with it"? And
No. It's a very valid question because you're right. Why should I be able to turn on a light in my bathroom and not disintegrate wherever I step outside? And
is there a specific wavelength? Surely
Actually,
UVs.
Actually, they do pretty good. You know how
It's
they
absolutely
described earlier
right.
that things of faith tend to hurt vampires? That's the part you need to question.
Uh-huh.
One of the earliest things worshipped was the sun, and it's still something that people hold in high regard.
yeah, well, no, that's
that
you got
answers that question there. Bam, that solved the
There's
biggest
absolutely
mystery
That's all.
universe.
That was
That
nice.
was a very
I didn't put much thought into
satisfactory
it.
answer. I'm gonna
That-
go
That's
with
that said, there's
Blue
been a
light.
couple vampire stories out there that have explored that have made it so that it's like
They sparkle.
or look at like the Blade series. It's all about UV light.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with sunlight, but if you turn on a UV flashlight, you're gonna burn a vampire.
Yeah.
I just have to say I really appreciated you not making Bill sparkle. That's all.
Yeah. Oh God, thank God. I would have thrown it away.
No sparkly vampires for me. We have any more questions? We still got time, guys. You got 13 minutes. Ask all the questions you want. All right, Mike.
So I've only gotten as far as the first book, but so far I've enjoyed it a lot. I plan on finishing the series, but I've always thought the big hole in the plan in the beginning. You know how with the she's trying to help him look tough in order to save him, and it's like, and Night Razor didn't believe it, and he was like, I don't know how you got her to go along with it, but I'm not buying it. You think he could have just compelled her to be like, all right, tell me the truth. What's going on? She could have been blah, 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 blah. And it would have fallen apart.
Yes, and no, because I actually I won't spoil it, but that is actually touched upon later in the series about why that wouldn't have worked.
So so it's explained later down the line.
Yes.
You're gonna have to read it.
I guess I will.
I haven't found out, but I've got a pretty good idea, even in book 5.
Very
I don't
cool.
wanna-
Lynn
I don't
had a
wanna-
question, I think,
I
also.
speculate and ruin it.
Yeah, because now I'm thinking I have to start reading these books, but I'm just curious, so I can visualize. Who, if you cast Bill, what actor or person would you cast as Bill the Vampire?
Oh God. It's really hard to who would be a perfect Bill is Chris Pratt, but he'd have to put back on his Parks and Recs weight.
Okay,
I think
that that's a
lose a
great,
foot.
that's a good visual.
Oh, he totally would.
Like he could, like he's a little older than like Bill is in the stories. Bill's like mid-20s, but he could get the attitude down pat. I mean, if you want to go back a little bit further, like Jonah Hill probably could have done justice too.
Now, if this were real, if vampires were a thing, do you like the way that Bill was like, I'm a vampire, and like Ed and Tom are like, cool. Do you like think, like, do you have any of your friends, or do you think that's realistic that they'd be that into like the gaming and the genres that they just wouldn't be surprised and they'd just be like, that's cool, let's use you as like an experiment and like test all this stuff out?
Yes.
Well,
I know John's like, yes.
Yeah. Something, one trope I have always hated in everything is that whole thing, like, okay, look at like the X-Men. Oh, hey, we're friends for life. Oh, I found out you have mutant powers. Oh, now I'm terrified of you. I've always found that to just be such BS, because if you're a really good friend of somebody, you're not just gonna like just turn them away like that, unless they try to kill you or so. Like, just because they say, hey, look, I can cause sparks from my fingertips, you're going to be like, okay, that's kind of cool, And here's the thing. If your friends are geeks and you show up with like, with superpowers, they're rather than like freaking out, they're probably going to be like, okay, this is awesome. Now we have to see what exactly will kill you and won't kill you. I just always hated that. I just always hated that thing. So I'm like, something, if you turn on your friends that easily, you're not really a real friend. Like, and Bill shows up, he doesn't attack his friends. He tries really hard to like hold on to his humanity, and his friends kind of acknowledge that of like, well, okay, you're still you, and you as yourself are not really scary, so why should you be scary as a vampire?
Oddity.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a bit about how different vampires can be in different worlds, how it's built around that concept, and it seems like yours has a different take. So what would be like your biggest, either your favorite or your biggest inspiration as far as what a vampire essentially is? Like, what are their weaknesses? What are their strengths?
I would say I really like the way both Buffy the Vampire Slayer and also the Blade movies handled vampires. I really like the way both of them handled that, and that they were powerful, but they weren't like ridiculously powerful. Like what was it? If you go back several years, it was either 70s or 80s, they had Frank Langella as like Dracula. And one thing that annoyed me about that movie was that Dracula pretty much was Superman. There was like almost nothing he couldn't do, and I'm like, a bad guy or a hero without weaknesses is dull. So you want him to be powerful, but you don't want him to be utterly invincible. You want him to have weaknesses, and here's the thing: you want him to have weaknesses that a normal person could exploit, because otherwise it just makes any humans in the story really just cattle.
And then where did you come up with the concept, or how did you format the free will concept? And I know a lot of that gets explained later. So, without giving too many spoilers away, do you want to explain that concept a little bit for those who haven't, read past book one, or for those who hadn't started it yet?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of like the classic vampire powers is like, and you see this all the way back in like the Bela Lugosi movies, is vampires can like can kind of like do this domination thing. I call it compulsion in my books, where it's kind of like a psychic element where they can like dominate. And in this series, it's weaker vampires or strong enough vampires can dominate humans, and I was like, all right, well, let's play with this. What, like, the same way that humans can be born with like, like genetic quirks and like differences and stuff. I'm like, well, what if there's like, was a vampire variant out there that these powers didn't work on? So that kind of was where the free will concept started. It just kind of popped in my head. I was like, well, what if like, this hierarchy of vampires, like if you're a hierarchy of vampires and like, the stronger vampires can control the weaker vampires, what's like the one thing you would one, fear, or two, not be able to stand? And that's, you make a vampire and suddenly that doesn't work on them. You know, it like, and that's where the concept of free will comes in. Like you absolutely cannot control them. And as I built up that thing, I kind of gradually started to add other powers. I'm like, well, if you just can't be compelled, that's one thing. But I'm like, what else kind of makes these guys powerful? So I kind of started it like, and not to spoil it, but you kind of learn about this in book 2, and it's not really a spoiler. It's basically you learn that like free wills used to be kind of this like almost kind of like a warrior class of the vampires. They were these vampires that couldn't be controlled, but they also had other powers that made them like really kind of feared and stuff. But they haven't been seen in a long time. And like in over like 700 years, there haven't been like free will seen. So that's why Bill is kind of like he's a novelty, but he's also something to be feared. So he's almost kind of a vampire mutation, if you will.
Matt.
Yeah, it's one thing now that I've noticed now that I'm like working my way through the books, and I was wondering if it's by design or just kind of the way your writing style is, that like the vampires seem to like whatever like lifestyle or attitude they had when they were turned, they kind of like maintain a piece of that. Like Bill, for instance, he's like this weird goofy guy. He maintains that as vampire, but even like characters like Gan, when she's like 12 years old, she's 300 and something years old, but she's still kind of 12. And like Night Razor, he's like I don't remember exactly how old he was.
Still
He
a
was
jerk.
Like 70 or 80 years old or something, but he's like still a jerk. It's like something he just like they seem incapable of like being able to grow past like from when they were turned.
I don't think it's incapable so much as don't want to.
Okay.
Like for example, like there's the story that's told from Sally's perspective, Sunset Strip, kind of like goes into how she was as a human and how she was at her early days as a vampire. I think more, and also James, like he's a guy who kind of who kind of evolved over the years. So I think it's more one of those. It's vampires are like people. Some of them are capable of growth, and some of them don't really see a need to. Like Bill likes who he is, so he doesn't really he grows over the series, but he doesn't really see a need immediately to change who he is. And the same thing is Jeff / Night Razor is one of those guys where he's gotten through life being a complete brutal asshole. So really, what reason is there for him to change?
Then you got like Gan, who's like kind of seems incapable of growing up. I mean, I'm only in book 5, and I know she's coming back. So, and I'm really looking forward to it. But even at the end of book 4, which was really good, by the way. I loved book 4. How she was like, because the Wanderer had talked about how
just be careful with spoilers.
Right. Okay. Yes. James had talked about how she's like super wise, and you don't really get it because she's so weird. And then all of a sudden, in book 4, you're like,
a little weird.
Okay, I get it. She's way cooler than she has been so far. And but she's still like walking around with a little SpongeBob backpack and stuff.
Well, I think in certain cases you are going to be stuck there's going to be certain traits, and you learn later on actually kind of what constitutes a vampire, how they become vampires and all that. So, we'll say you learn that later in the series, but like in certain cases, and it's also kind of explained a bit why Gan is the way she is. But it really kind of comes down to your circumstances when you're turned, but also what kind of person you are. And I mean, in her case. Yeah. I mean, she's a 12-year-old who is just kind of starting puberty, and even though mentally she's very smart, there's kind of she's kind of always stuck in there's certain parts of that are always going to be stuck on her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you always fall within a subculture depending on your physical traits. I mean, look at Jeff. He was a big guy, so he fell naturally within the frat culture that developed later in his life. I mean, he was 120, I think, guys.
Yep.
That's how old
about
he
120.
was.
Yeah.
Which that culture wasn't necessarily around back then, but
Well, even other,
since
like,
he's the big guy,
Samuel
he
and
quickly
stuff,
Yeah,
got
but-
into
but-
it and
but
became
here-
modern.
But here's the thing:
Whereas-
cruel people have always been around. So even if the jock mentality is relatively recent, there have always been people who have just who have just been stronger, and they've just lorded it over people.
Oh yeah. But I'm just saying that he developed into more of that culture as it came into cultural relevance. And
Yeah,
as for
so it's
the
like-
kid, if she's always going to be 12 years old, she'll probably always fall within that kind of mindset to some extent because that's just the culture
Right.
that
Yeah,
she
so, like-
sees and observes and fits with her circumstances.
Yeah, because he was probably a jerk 120 years ago. Then he just found other jerks that he could evolve with as time went on
Yeah.
because he's 120
Found an
years
other ways
old.
to be
So
a jerk.
he's like, who are the jerks in this century and this decade? And those are the guys that.
kind of
I mean, I haven't got to this point yet, but how old is Gan?
12. Oh, like
I mean,
physical,
actual
or like
old.
for real? 320 something.
You
Is
think
that right?
kids back then were acting the same way exactly? Walking around with SpongeBob backpacks?
yeah, exactly. They're like feeding her cereal.
She's
and
obviously
stuff, like,
adapting herself to be
Yeah.
like a modern day 12-year-old, so
Yeah.
she looks the part. If she was walking around with dyed hair and tattoos, people would turn an eye to her.
Well, I
That's
mean,
true.
I mean, that's the thing. Same thing with James. As I said, this is a guy who who keeps an open mind, who realizes that he probably could live in the past and relive the good old days, but that's not really going to help him get ahead when he actually steps outside the door. So he keeps an open mind, and as he strikes me as one of those people that, as the world changes, he changes. He makes it a point to change with the world. Whereas some of these other older vamps, they're going to be more stuck in the past. They're going to be like, well, hey, I remember the good old days when I could when I could ride with the Mongol hordes and cut down people. And I'm like, why did the world ever move on from that? So I wanted to treat vampires like people, and people are all different. Some of them are capable of change, some of them are not. Some of them have closed minds, some of them have open minds. So I just wanted the vampires more to be people than just necessarily stereotypes.
Very
change
cool. We'll
your
take
offer.
one last question. I saw Mike in the back had one.
I like how when he was describing past events like the Trojan War and everything, and he was like, oh, it wasn't this like war of good and evil. It was a trade war. It was a war over trade laws, and I love that, like how it was like, forget all this Hollywood good versus evil nonsense. Like it was a whole war between vampires and humans over trade.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny. I love
Well,
it.
They did several
that
times.
was
That's good.
that was one of my favorite passages to write because
It was one of my favorites to read.
yeah. Oh, thanks. Because it's one of those things, like I've always been a history buff, and I'm always like, okay, well, we have the romanticized version of history, but you got to know that the reality is probably going to be different. And just taking something like that and taking the romantic idea of Helen of Troy out of it and saying that's the story, but the reality is it was all about gold. I just
The
like
thing
that
is,
idea.
That's almost more realistic anyway. It's like
Yeah.
it's like I said, you find
Yeah.
like the romanticized story, what's more likely, and then you kind of find this little humorous thing on the more likely side.
Well, for the longest time,
Well,
that's all we
also-
knew about Troy was that romanticized story. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but if you look into history deeper, you see that the Greek city-states, they would go to war all the time, and usually it was about trade or or power. It usually had nothing to do with, oh, you stole my queen. So why wouldn't the Trojan War in reality be any different?
Exactly. Yeah.
But it makes a better story if it's like a love story as opposed to a lesson in economics.
All right, guys, we are out of time. So I know that on this book club meeting, we usually vote on our next book, which I know you guys don't see the books up here. I figured we wanted to take the whole time to be able to speak with Rick. So there's going to be a half-hour long event next week where you guys can come in and vote for the next book for February. So those will be ready for you. I'll post it probably next Tuesday after Sloan's show. So that way Sloan can give me all of his people to come read. And I also want to thank Rick. Thank you so much for coming and kind of being my guinea pig with the whole VR thing. I know everyone here was really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, so
Thanks
thank
for
you
having
so
me.
much.
This was great.
Where's your book for sale?
Yeah,
Amazon?
right now it used to be wide, but right now it's exclusive to Amazon because I'm part of their Kindle Unlimited program.
Cool.
Yeah, so if you guys have Kindle Unlimited, you can read all 8 books on Kindle Unlimited, which is what I did, and I think it's what, I don't know if Matt, that's what you're doing if you did. Yep.
I didn't. I just bought them.
Yay. But you
it's
guys
all-
can
it's-
get them there on Amazon. Yep.
I was
Go
gonna say it's also in paperback and audio. So like, I try to cover the bases there. Some people like to have a book in their hand, and some people like, they're on the road all the time. So there's audio. The entire series is on audio as well.
All right. So again, guys, thanks so much. Thanks, Rick. And then hopefully we'll be able to get some more people in, and you can come watch them, and it'll be great. And thank you guys for coming and all of your awesome questions.